Hi, I am Samuel Vine, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, I actually got really excited about this build, so I decided to go ahead and share it with everyone. I managed to, in ISE solo, which ISE and HSE solos are pretty much all I do, um, I actually managed to take on in ISE the gate and the cube and the fleet all at the same time, and I managed to survive that whole conflict, so I got really excited about that. Then, as you'll also see from the thumbnail, in HSE, I managed to hit 1.3 mil, which is actually pretty damn good for HSE. So I thought I'd go ahead and slap together a build guide and let you all know what I did and why. So let's take a look. First, I am on the Voth Stronghold. This was an event ship from early this year or late last year, I believe, 2026 or 2025. I do not remember exactly when. So without further ado, let's check out the build. First and foremost, this is a tanky broadside build, but I do not have Breen's Free Fire from the Odd Thought yet. So what I've done is I've used ETM or Entwined Tactical Matrices, which is why you see that I'm using a torpedo here. Specifically for the torpedo, I'm using the spatial torpedo launcher from the Lobi store. And the reason for that is that it has a very short cooldown of 2 seconds and a 180-degree targeting arc, so I can use it more reliably when I need a broadside. And as for why I'm using the spatial instead of another wide angle torpedo, I really like the low cooldown because it lets me trigger one of my traits pretty regularly, and I don't need any cooldown assistance to trigger that trait reliably. So to continue, I'm still using the advanced Thoron infused Polaron beam array. You may recognize this from my previous Rainbow ATM build video guide, which I will link in the description. This is actually my second build guide, so feel free to like and subscribe and never miss another video. Then I'm also using the Terran Task Force Disruptor Beam Array. The Terran Task Force weapons are extremely potent, mostly because of their special proc, which if you read the tooltip here, it says that it can go up to 200% Cat 1 damage boost from its base damage, depending on your opponent's hull strength. And that up to 200% Cat 1 damage is when the enemy is at 25% hull. So this is a very powerful weapon in every flavor. But since I'm using a different phaser weapon, I decided to use the Terran Disruptor as my specifically used Terran weapon in this build. And as for that other phaser, I'm actually running the phaser narrow angle beam arrays. I'm running two of them, one in the fore, one in the ass. And these come from the Colony 3 promo ship. I got these last year with my event campaign. They are very powerful beam arrays. What they do is they have a slightly smaller targeting arc in exchange for increased damage. You'll see that most beam arrays have a targeting arc of 250 degrees. These narrow angles are simply 210 degrees, but their damage is increased. So I'm using both of them, and you can only slot two of these in any given build. Then, because this is what I have access to at the moment, I'm using the Tetrion Beam Array with the Over mod. This is one of the crafted ones you can pick up on the exchange. It's not the most ideal Tetrion Beam Array, but honestly, it's my only Tetrion Beam Array. So this is what I decided to use. When I have a chance, this one would be replaced with something else, but for now, it still works. Then in the ass again, I have the omnidirectional Baul linked Sentry anti-proton beam array. This is from the Lobi store. I actually really like using this weapon. It has a shorter recharge time of 0.5 seconds instead of 1 second. So I'm able to get a decent chunk of damage out of this weapon. And last but not least, of course, is the Pavan Omni, which is here because it has its own proc of Resonance Charge, I believe it's called. And that does an extreme amount of damage, especially when under firing modes. So, and I actually realized in my last video, my last build guide, I skipped the deflector, impulse, warp core, and shield. So I apologize for that, and I will go over my choices for them here in this build. For my deflector, I'm using the Elite Fleet Intervention Protomatter Deflector. This one is what you get from the Fleet Colony, and I picked this because of the Cold Crit modification. This gives additional crit chance and severity based on my hull percentage. The other mods that I have are just what I was using for other builds. I have not gone through and optimized this yet, but it works quite well for what it does, so I'm still using it. Then I have the competitive reputation engines, prevailing innovated impulse. These give flight speed and flight turn rate buffs primarily based on firing mode activations, which in my build I'm using 3. So I will be proccing this pretty regularly and is very helpful, especially for these larger ships. And for my warp core and shield, I'm actually running the Disco 2-piece because this is more survivability focused. The 2-piece here with the warp core and shield, when you look under more details, you'll see that the 2-piece description says that it gives 120% hull regeneration rate. That's a lot of hull regen, so that's why I use it here in this build. The shield does have another perk in that it causes enemies to take increased shield damage from your weapons based on your shield power rating, but I don't really have that much in my shield power rating, so it's at minimum strength. But it's still something, so I would recommend, at least for now, using the Disco 2-piece from the Discovery Reputation. Now, onto my devices. These are actually the same as my previous build. I'm using the SSN TARS Distress Protocol, Red Matter Capacitor, Temporal Negotiator, Subspace Field Modulator, and Deuterium Surplus. Honestly, 3 of these 5 are negotiable. You can use other devices as you have access to them, but I've mentioned before that I am really, really terrible at using consumable devices, so I like sticking with the ones that are always going to be there. But that's just a personal comfort thing. Use whatever devices you find most appropriate for you. Now, the consoles. This is a crate build, so I am using 100% universal consoles. And I'm using a few here that are designed for survivability in addition to damage. So let's first go through my tactical consoles. First is the Voth console Subspace Fractured Tunneling Field. This is more hull regeneration, some temporary hit points, and importantly, universal console reduction by 25% on a 30-second cooldown, and it can be cooled down itself. So this is a must-have for all uni-console builds. Then I'm using the Agony Redistributor from the Adamant in the C-Store. This is kind of a weird console. It's been up and down in the buff and nerf list over the years, but it's in a really good place right now, and it is consistently one of my top damage dealers because what it does is it hits my target, and everything that I do to that target that does damage, that damage is stored, and a percentage of it is kind of like duplicated in a way. Um, and that damage is also spread out to other targets. So even though I'm using this on a fire at will build, I still use it and I still get a considerable damage boost from using this console. Next up is Voth from the GOM2, which was the 2026 Summer Event ship. This is here for damage resistance, some weapon power boost, and enemy weapon systems offline, since I have it in the tactical console slot. Next up is science consoles. This first one, directed dilithium resonance destabilizer. This one is actually here as a bit of a hybrid DPS and survivability focused console. It gives me some better turn rate and some better shield strength, but the main thing that I'm using it for is when I activate it in a 5 kilometer point blank range radius, it gives radiation damage every second to targets that are hit. Then after 6 seconds, it does a big burst of radiation damage, but it also gives me increased flight speed and shield regeneration on each facing. So this is both for survivability and for damage. Next up, I've got the Gemini device from the Premonition in the C store. This one is a passive of 20% Cat 1 exotic damage. That's nice, but not the most applicable for me. Instead, I'm using this for the active abilities, which is 20% weapon firing cycle haste, and the summons of the 2 copies of the USS Enterprise F Odyssey class. Those things hit like a truck. The only downside to this console is that it slows down my ship when I activate it, so my actual movement speed is reduced. But it's still one of my hardest hitting console abilities. Next up, I have the Micro Quantum Torpedoes Phalanx Array. This is from the Achilles in the C store. It fires off a bunch of torpedoes, gives me some additional weapons power, and weapon power cost reduction, and a few other things. This is a really handy console. Next, in the engineering slots, I have Broadside Combat Module, also called Full Broadside. This is from the Kerala in the C store and is pretty much a necessity in broadside builds. It is the most powerful, or at least one of the most powerful, broadside support mechanisms in the game. The one note that I have on this console is that you have to place it in a keybind by itself, because if you put it on the spam bar, it is a toggle and it will just either refuse to activate or will cancel cast over and over again, and you will get nothing out of it if you put it on spam bar. So I have it here on a keybind by itself, and I will actually plan on doing a separate video on my keybind setup at a future date, so keep an eye out for that. Next up is You Are Dismissed. This is from the Ethereum lockbox, and it can be found pretty cheap on the exchange. Its passives are they're okay. Shield resistance, shield regen, and a chance for protonic crush. But the main reason to use this console is for its damage. It is a very, very hard hitting proton damage console, and it ignores shields. So it's consistently one of my high damage dealers, and I would recommend using this on most builds, at least as a mid tier, and I think some high end builds still use it. I definitely recommend using this. Next up is Temporal Disorder. This is a must have for me, especially for survivability. Now, the 4 ships that it creates when you activate it do a lot of damage, and then they explode over time and will provide damage to enemies and will give you some speed and turn rate buff when they expire or are destroyed. But the fact that it summons 4 copies of your ship that attack the enemies at will, so you don't have to control them or do anything, they just attack. Um, this is a very, very handy console, and I learned about using it from Nick and B a while ago. This is the console that made ISE possible for me. Um, I might be able to find like workarounds to not use it now, but I love using this console. And it does have a 2 minute and 30-second cooldown, but you can still use this very frequently with enough uncon triggers, and if you have the noble trait as well. Next up, I have Fleet Power Network Array. This is from the Awani in the C store, and it is also a must-have for energy weapon belts. The passives are just a little bit of max aux power and some exotic particle generators, but the main reason is the energy weapon firing cycle haste. Um, Again, pretty much everyone uses this in powerful builds, and I see why, and I do not ever want to not use this console. Lastly, for the engineering consoles, I have Crown and Chronophage. Cooldown reduction for science and temporal abilities. I don't have temporal abilities on this build, but it does do a lot of damage, and it also triggers shields offline to enemies that it hits. Next, in the Universal consoles, I have Hunting Pack Escorts from the new Cavort, which came from an event ship in Season 36. This one is the passives are crit chance and severity for pets that are near the birds of prey that this console summons, but the birds of prey themselves do a lot of damage. So I highly recommend using this console if you have it. Next is a survivability focused console. This is a very unusual choice, and I'm actually only using it because it's what I have, and I do not yet have any of the fancier toys, and I found that this worked sufficiently enough for what I wanted to do, and I actually pretty much like this console. It's not like a top tier console, I don't think, but it is useful. What it does is it improves my shield restoration or healing and increases my shield capacity. But when I activate this console, it ejects my shields, which sounds counterintuitive, but what it does is it uses my shield strength to do damage to nearby targets within a cone on each of my shield facings. But then 12% of my outgoing energy weapon damage is applied as shield healing. So this is another one of those consoles like the dilithium resonance destabilizer that is hybrid damage and hybrid tanking. Lastly, I'm using the bioelectric wave capacitor. This is from the Kami 3 again. This has nice buffs in the passive section, but honestly, even as a Broadsider, I'm still using this console for the power, the subsystem power buffs, and the flight speed and turn rates. And if you manage to get an enemy caught in its wake, it'll still do a decent chunk of damage. So, my bridge officers, I am using, I believe, 9 uncon triggers. And those are starting with the engineering and miracle workers stations. Emit unstable warp bubble 3. I could be using a different uncon trigger here. I could be using eject warp plasma, but I did notice that this skill, even though it has a long cooldown, has a lot of enemy damage reduction. So since I was focused on survivability and I was concerned about my survivability, I went ahead and just used this as a bit of a buffer for self-protection. Next is Gravitic Induction Platform 1. This also has a bit of a long cooldown, but it does not share a shared cooldown with Emit Warp Bubble like Eject Warp Plasma does. So I went ahead and used it here. This is an uncon trigger from Miracle Worker that was added to the game some months ago. Then I'm using Null Pointer Flood 1 in the Ensign slot. This is also an uncon trigger that was added a few months ago. Additionally, I'm also running Emergency Powered Weapons 2 for its trait interaction. Next up for the uncon triggers in Intel slot, I'm running Ionic Turbulence 2, Electromagnetic Pulse Probe, and Viral Impulse Burst 1. Those are all uncon triggers, so they reduce my Universal Console cooldowns. Then I have Gravity Well 1, Scramble Sensors 1, and Jam Targeting Sensors 1 as the rest of my 9 uncon triggers. Now, my firing modes, I have to use Entwined Tactical Matrices because it is my only Fire at Will extender right now. So I have Fire at Will 1 and Torpedo Spread 1 because that's what fits in the Bridge Officer Station on this ship. Other ships can do it differently, and I will get into testing those at a later date, but this works very well for what the ship is. My last firing mode is Cannon Rapid Fire. Even though I'm not running a single cannon, I'm still using this because of Hellbore Light from the Warden in the Z-Store. That Starship trait is very powerful, especially in high bomb slot. And I will get into that when I go into the trade interactions. But that is why I am using Cannon's Rapid Fire. It's not 100% uptime, and its uptime is even reduced by Entwined Tactical Matrices, but I did notice that it is still worth using as a Bridge Officer slot and as a trait slot. So let's actually go over the traits right now. Personal space traits, I'll just list these off. A Good Day to Die, Ethereum Beam Enhancements for the stacking energy weapon damage, Brain Shield Tunneling for shield and armor pen, Fragment of AI Tech for energy weapon damage, Intelligence Agent Attaché for counter ability recharge on weapon criticals, Particle Manipulator, since I have 9 uncon triggers, this will improve the critical chance for those skills, as well as the crit severity. And I'm also running Terran Targeting Systems for additional crit severity, the Boimler Effect for Bridge Officer cooldown reduction, Twinkling Lights for enemy debuff based on the number of energy types that I'm using, and I'm using several. And then, of course, I'm using Unconventional Systems, the must-have. This is a crate build, so reducing the cooldown of my Universal Consoles is a must. For my Starship traits, I am first running Emergency Weapon Cycle. This is the one that interacts with Emergency Powered Weapons. This is very important for me because I don't have, oops, I accidentally deselected it there. Because I do not have some of the fancy toys yet, so I'm still dependent on reducing weapon power cost. And this is what that skill does. And it also increases my firing cycle haste every time that I use emergency powered weapons. Next up is Entwined Tactical Matrices. Whenever I activate Torpedo Spread, I get Fire at Will, and whenever I activate Fire at Will, I get a Torpedo Spread. Since I don't have any other way to increase the duration for my Fire at Will, this is a must-have. If I had Brains Free Fire or Redirecting Arrays, those would be nice, but they're not required because this works just fine. The only thing to note about ETM is that it will interfere, the cannon scatter volley will interfere with my cannon's rapid fire. So that's something to remember when using Hellbore Light. It does still work, and that's why in my tray configuration, I actually activate Cannon's Rapid Fire first, then I activate Fire at Will, and then later I'll activate Torpedo Spread. That way I get as much use out of Hellbore as I can manage. Next up, in my Starship traits, I'm using Universal Designs for the crit chance and crit severity on Universal Console use. This is from the Crossfield Refit, which is another premium ship that I got the year before from the annual campaign. Next, to hell with our orders, or as I like to call it, THWU. This gives more universal console reduction based on using captain abilities, and it can also increase my flight speed and turn rate. Next is temporal tunneling for some extra weapon firing cycle haste. This is from the Atlantis and Sea Store. I've already mentioned Hellbore Light. This does shield drain and damage when you're using either beam overload or cannon rapid fire. You do not have to be using weapons that use those firing modes. You just have to have the firing mode active. And then last but not least is broadside beam support from the Corolla in the Sea Store. This, whenever you're using fire at will, especially, you get additional phaser beam shots, I should say, from your broadsides, your left and your right. But your positioning is important because they will only fire if an enemy is within 5 kilometers of you. So be mindful of your positioning. You have to get pretty close to your targets and be skirting alongside them in order for this trait to activate. But it does do quite a bit of damage. Space Reputation, using Tyler's Duality for the crit chance, Precision for the crit chance, Advanced Targeting Systems for crit severity, and Auxiliary Power Configuration Offense for bonus Cat 2 damage based on my auxiliary power level, and Radiant Detonation Matrix. This has a chance proc to do radiation damage, and it actually triggers a lot. I wish I would stop accidentally deselecting my stuff. Triggers quite a lot when you have high weapon firing cycle haste. And lastly, in my active space reputations, I'm using Anti-Time Entanglement Singularity for some damage, Refracting Tetrion Cascade for some damage, but then I'm also using 2 defensive skills here. Deploy Sensor Interference. This one gets some bonus hull strength. It spawns a platform that taunts the enemy and reduces the enemy's outgoing damage. And it gains some hull depending on how many allies you're around. And I'm also using Quantum Singularity Manipulation for it gives some boost to my science stats, but it cloaks my ship and while still letting me fire my weapons, but it's protection. I'm cloaked, I'm harder for the enemy to detect, and harder for them to target, if they can target me at all. Now, another thing that I neglected to mention previously in my last build guide was my duty officers, so I'll go over them quickly. I'm using, I have no idea how to pronounce these names, so I'm just going to say what they do. A Space Warfare Specialist for hull healing based on my tactical abilities. Projectile Weapons Officer, a chance for crit severity stacking on firing projectiles. And since I'm using a missile, that will be triggering quite often. And I'm actually using 2 projectile weapons officers for the stacking crit severity buff. And I'm also using 2 of the same crit severity stacking buff, but for energy weapons. And then I'm using a flight deck officer to reduce the recharge of my hangar bay by a few extra seconds. That one can be replaced if you feel comfortable with your hangar pets dying a little bit more often and not being replaced quite as quickly, but so if you have like a battery officer or any other category of duty officer that you would like to use, this would be a good flex slot. So I believe that is everything for my build, and I will say that I am very happy with this. I was able to do 1.228 mil in an ISE, where I was able to take on the gate spawning fleet, and the Borg cube, be in the middle of all of them all at once, and tank the damage from all of 3 groups at the same time and win the fight. I was also able to do 1.3 mil in Hive Onslaught Elite solo, and taking on as many of the board ships as possible all at once. And this felt very comfortable to play. Play around with it and see what you think. And I have the fights recorded and included here at the end for both HSE and ISE. So thank you very much for paying attention to me ramble for this long duration. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you again soon. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment. Enjoy.
You cannot defeat me. You cannot defeat the Borg.
Scanning the nanite transformer. Done.